A young American soldier named Jimmy Thompson pushes through thick Vietnamese jungle, machete in hand, clearing vines from the narrow trail. His squad moves in single file behind him, exhausted from 3 days of patrol in 110-degree heat. Without warning, something snaps to his right. Before he can turn his head, a 7-foot length of bamboo whips out from the tree line at chest height. 5 sharpened stakes slam into his abdomen with enough force to knock him backward. As he collapses, screaming, the real horror begins. Those stakes were not just sharp, they were coated in something worse. This is the bamboo whip, and unlike most booby traps in Vietnam, it was not designed to kill you. It was designed to make you wish you were dead. The bamboo whip stands out from other Viet Cong traps for one simple reason. It was engineered with cruelty as the primary objective. While a punji pit or a grenade trap aimed to take soldiers out of action quickly, the bamboo whip had a different purpose. Keep them alive, keep them suffering, and make absolutely certain they never make it home. If you want to hear more dark stories from military history that most people do not know about, feel free to subscribe. We are covering the brutal realities of warfare that textbooks leave out. The construction of a bamboo whip was deceptively simple, but the thought that went into where to place it and how to use it reveals something darker about the strategic thinking behind it. First, Viet Cong soldiers would find a long, flexible piece of bamboo, anywhere from 6 to 10 feet in length. The thicker the bamboo, the more force it could deliver. They would trim it down until it was just right, springy enough to store energy, but strong enough not to crack under tension. Then they would carve bamboo stakes. These were not random spikes. They were carefully shaped. They were about 4 to 6 inches long, sharpened to needle points, and attached to the whip at specific angles. The angle mattered because it determined what happened when the stakes entered a body. If the stakes angled upward, they would slide under the ribs. If they angled downward, they would tear through the intestines. And here is where it gets calculated. The Viet Cong knew exactly which angle caused the most damage without hitting anything immediately fatal. The stakes were positioned to target 2 specific areas, the groin and the lower abdomen, not the chest, not the head. Those would kill too fast. The goal was to pierce the soft tissue of the stomach, shred intestines, puncture the bladder, or rip through the groin area where major blood vessels run close to the surface. Wounds that would bleed, but not hemorrhage. Injuries that would cause infection, but not instant death. It was precision brutality. But the stakes themselves were not enough. This is where the Viet Cong took things to another level. After sharpening the bamboo, they would coat each stake in buffalo dung, and sometimes in human waste. Sometimes they would mix that with rotting meat or decayed vegetation. The goal was to introduce as much bacteria into the wound as possible. In the heat and humidity of the Vietnamese jungle, an open wound was already a ticking time bomb. Adding fecal matter to the equation turned that wound into a biological disaster. Here is what happens when a bamboo stake coated in buffalo dung enters your stomach. The moment it punctures your skin, you feel the initial impact. That is adrenaline kicking in, dulling the pain just enough for your brain to register what happened. Then the stakes pull out, and that is when the real pain starts. Those stakes are not smooth. Bamboo fibers create microabrasions inside the wound channel, tearing tissue on the way out. Every bit of bacteria coating those stakes is now deep inside your body. Within hours, your wound starts to swell. The infection sets in fast. In a jungle environment where temperatures hover around 90 to 110 degrees and humidity sits at 80%, bacteria multiply at an alarming rate. Your immune system tries to fight it off, but you are already weakened from dehydration, exhaustion, and the physical trauma of the injury. Your body temperature spikes. Fever sets in. You start shaking uncontrollably, and that is just the beginning. The real cruelty of this trap was not just the physical damage, it was the time frame. A soldier hit by a bamboo whip would not die in minutes. He would die over days, sometimes a week, and during that time, he would be fully conscious, fully aware of what was happening to him. The infection spreads through his abdominal cavity. His stomach cramps. He cannot eat. He cannot drink. Every movement sends waves of pain through his core, and his squad has to carry him. That was the strategic brilliance of it. The Viet Cong understood that killing one soldier was useful, but wounding one soldier and forcing his entire squad to slow down, carry him, and try to save him, that was far more valuable. A dead soldier is left behind. A wounded soldier becomes an anchor. His screams give away your position. His need for medical attention drains your supplies. The psychological impact on the rest of the squad is devastating. They are not just fighting an enemy. They are watching their friend die slowly, knowing there is nothing they can do to stop it. Medical evacuation in Vietnam was inconsistent at best. If you were hit in an area with helicopter access, you might be airlifted out in 30 minutes. But if you were deep in the jungle, miles from any landing zone, extraction could take hours, sometimes days. For a soldier with a gut wound full of infected bamboo punctures, every hour mattered. The longer it took to get him to a field hospital, the worse his chances became. Even if he made it to a medic, the treatment options were limited. Jungle combat medics carried basic supplies, bandages, morphine, and maybe some sulfa powder to fight infection. But a wound contaminated with buffalo dung required serious antibiotics and surgical debridement. That meant opening the wound, cleaning out dead tissue, and flushing the entire area with sterile solution. In a field hospital with proper equipment, that was manageable. In the middle of the jungle, with nothing but a combat knife and some iodine, it was a death sentence. The psychological warfare element of the bamboo whip went beyond the wounded soldier. Every man in the squad saw what happened. They saw their point man get hit. They heard him scream. They watched him writhe on the ground, clutching his stomach and begging for help. And they knew it could happen to any of them at any moment. That kind of fear doesn't just slow you down physically, it breaks you mentally. Soldiers began second-guessing every step. Every vine, every shadow, every rustling leaf became a potential threat. They would inch forward, eyes scanning the tree line, trying to spot tripwires that were almost invisible. Some soldiers refused to take point. Others developed jungle anxiety, a constant state of hypervigilance that led to exhaustion, paranoia, and eventually, mistakes. And mistakes in the jungle got you killed. But here's the thing. The bamboo whip was not just about wounding soldiers. It was about demoralizing entire units. When word spread through a company that someone had been hit by a whip trap, it changed the way everyone operated. Patrols moved slower. Soldiers became more hesitant. That hesitation gave the Viet Cong exactly what they wanted: more time to set up ambushes, more opportunities to strike, and more psychological leverage over an already exhausted enemy. The placement of these traps was another calculated decision. Viet Cong soldiers did not just put them up randomly. They studied American patrol patterns. They knew which trails U.S. forces used most often. They knew where soldiers were likely to let their guard down, and they positioned bamboo whips in those exact spots. Near river crossings where soldiers were focused on the water, at the edge of clearings where troops thought they were finally in the open, along ridgelines where visibility was good, but attention was focused forward, not to the sides. One of the most effective placements was right after a known danger zone. Soldiers would navigate through a heavily trapped area, stay alert the entire time, and then relax slightly once they thought they were clear. That is when the whip would hit. It was psychological manipulation on a tactical level. The Viet Cong understood that human attention has limits. You cannot stay at maximum alertness for hours on end. Eventually, you slip, and that slip is when the trap gets you. The bamboo whip also had a secondary effect that often gets overlooked. It created a resource drain. Every wounded soldier required evacuation. Every evacuation required a helicopter, a medical evacuation crew, fuel, and medical personnel. In a war where logistics were already stretched thin, pulling resources to save soldiers wounded by traps meant fewer resources available for actual combat operations. The Viet Cong did not need to win firefights. if they could simply bleed the US military dry through attrition and resource depletion. The traps kept working long after the war ended. Because bamboo is organic, it eventually rots and disappears. But the knowledge of where these traps had been placed was lost. Vietnamese civilians returning to their villages after the war would stumble across old trails, not knowing they were still lined with forgotten booby traps. Some of those traps remained functional years later. Others had degraded enough that they would not spring properly, but the stakes were still there, still contaminated, still dangerous. This was a lingering danger. There is also a darker side to how these traps were used. Some reports suggest that certain Viet Cong units did not just coat the stakes in buffalo dung. They used human waste. Waste from soldiers who had died of disease was sometimes used. The logic was simple. If you are going to cause an infection, why not make it as deadly as possible? Soldiers who were hit by these stakes did not just deal with standard bacterial infections. They battled diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and cholera, all introduced directly into an open wound. The survival rate for soldiers hit by a contaminated bamboo whip was shockingly low. Even with proper medical care, the mortality rate sat around 40% for abdominal wounds in Vietnam. Add in the factor of contamination, delayed evacuation, and the stress of combat, and that number climbed higher. Some estimates put the survival rate for a soldier hit by a whip trap with contaminated stakes at less than 50%. For those who did survive, the recovery process was brutal. Weeks in a hospital, multiple surgeries, permanent damage to internal organs, and the psychological scars that came with knowing you almost died from a piece of sharpened bamboo covered in shit. But what makes the bamboo whip truly terrifying is how simple it was. Unlike a mine, which required explosives, or a grenade trap, which required stolen ordnance, a bamboo whip could be built in under an hour using nothing but materials found in the jungle. A machete, some vines, and access to animal waste. That is it. No technical expertise required. No supply chain needed. Just basic knowledge of physics, anatomy, and a willingness to inflict maximum suffering. The US military tried to counter these traps in several ways. They trained soldiers to spot tripwires, and they taught them how to disarm basic booby traps. They deployed mine detectors, though those were useless against bamboo. They even tried using dogs to sniff out traps, but dogs could not detect bamboo any better than humans could. The best defense was vigilance, and as we already established, you cannot stay vigilant forever. Some units adopted a scorched earth approach. If they suspected an area was heavily trapped, they would call in artillery or napalm to clear it, burn everything, collapse the traps, and move through the ashes. But that created its own problems. It destroyed potential cover, gave away your position, and did not always work. Bamboo whips set deep in the tree line could survive a napalm strike if they were positioned correctly. The lasting impact of the bamboo whip goes beyond the physical casualties. It represents a shift in how warfare was conducted. Traditional combat focused on firepower, maneuver, and taking territory. But the Viet Cong were not interested in holding ground. They were interested in making the cost of occupation so high that the enemy would eventually leave. Traps like the bamboo whip were part of that strategy. Death by 1,000 cuts. Each trap, each ambush, each casualty added up until the entire war effort became unsustainable. According to records from the US Department of Defense, booby traps and mines accounted for roughly 11% of all American deaths in Vietnam. That is around 6,000 soldiers. Another 15% of injuries, approximately 45,000 men, were attributed to traps. The bamboo whip was just one type among many, but its impact was disproportionate to its simplicity, because it was not just about the numbers. It was about the fear it created and the way it changed how soldiers operated. If stories like this interest you and you want to see more deep dives into the forgotten realities of war, make sure to subscribe. There is a lot more coming. Today, veterans who served in Vietnam still talk about the bamboo whip with a specific kind of dread. Not because it was the most lethal trap. It was not. But because it represented something worse than death. It represented suffering. Prolonged, intentional, calculated suffering. And that is something you do not forget. Decades later, The sound of snapping wood or rustling leaves can still trigger a reaction. In the jungle, those sounds meant one thing: you were about to get hit. The bamboo whip was not just a weapon, it was a statement. A reminder that in guerrilla warfare, the goal is not always to kill. Sometimes, the goal is to break you. And for thousands of American soldiers who encountered these traps, that is exactly what they did.